I know it is many moons ago since Mission Impossible 6 premiered, but since this movie year is so fucking terrible, this movie actually stands out as one of the better ones this year. I've never really been toe to toe with the Mission Impossible franchise. I've watched the first and it bored me to tears. The second one was a funny John Woo extravaganza, but ultimately useless. I've never seen MI3 or Ghost Protocol. For my German review channel back in the day, I lastly gave Rogue Nation a chance and it kinda won me over actually. With this movie I had absolutely no expectations or hope for greatness. The trailers of these are all overwhelmingly action-packed and in the end none of those movies can keep up the pace they set up. The same happened with Fallout, a movie with a spectacular first act like I've never seen before, but the longer the movie goes on, the more it reverts back to its old tropes I'm just tired of at this point. The beginning of this movie is nothing but breathtaking. We partake in an apocalyptic, tormenting vision of the protagonist to set the tone for the movie beautifully. The following mission exposition is so cut and dry, it really underlays the serious tone this franchise will take this time around. After all these different iterations, finally, this one feels like what it always was meant to be. A more grounded, but nonetheless more dynamic James Bond. Where other Mission Impossible movies were too naive and juvenile like the first one, too action-packed like 2 and 3, or too much focused on an action blockbuster without emotions or consequences, this sets a new bar. It is absolutely amazing how this movie doesn't let up from the very first minute, even though it tries to intercut with the known humor of many Tom Cruise movies and especially the more light-hearted Mission Impossible series. There is always a pressure on our heroes that isn't typical for this sort of movie. Cruise is so beaten up and beaten down by his beginning failures in this movie. It really is questionable how your typical movie Joe is gonna stomach all of that. Sadly, these are for the most part the first 20 minutes until the movie reverts to your typical mask-wearing, fake-outs, endless exposition discussions and back and forth about who is to blame and who is on top of a bureaucratical hierarchy. But I really appreciated that Tom Cruise and Henry Cavill, forced by the government to work together, wasn't elaborated, but instead the focus rested on showing the dynamic between both characters. Even though the action pieces that are set up aren't bad, they don't contribute anything really spectacular anymore, and together with more and more unnecessary exposition about the danger of this task, bog this movie down ultimately. The cinematography and especially the soundtrack are what saves this movie from mediocrity. There are some scenes in this movie that are not sad or riveting because of those ingredients, but simply astonishing in the execution. I wish I could show you those scenes in their entirety, which of course isn't possible here on YouTube. But if you have or haven't seen the movie, please notice this cathartic scene when Ethan Hunt realizes how a whole convoy of police force has to be murdered to achieve his goals this time. The set of strings that sets in really brings you down on reality, how much weight such a situation has. Sadly, the movie continues with your typical transporter sort of plot and many chase sequences without wit or intuition. On top, this was the moment I really felt that I just didn't care about the characters at all. There is no real arc and no real set out for any major development, but I actually have to give it to the movie that it is kinda refreshing to just watch this mission unfold. After half its runtime, the movie dissolves into its typical dance and play. Spies that work for different bosses with different agendas, double crossing. It gets tiresome really fast and loses all the amazing momentum it built up with upping the stakes and these end-time visions of Tom Cruise. It is interesting how the climax of Mission Impossible Fallout doesn't have a real build-up to it. This peak of tension is just suddenly there, and everyone gathers together to have this final showdown over plutonium cores. I won't spoil anything, but be assured that nothing of real consequence happens and none of the protagonists die, so please don't go into this movie expecting such bleak turns. The movie has fantastic pacing, great direction, sometimes screams and beautiful colors, and the soundtrack is one of the best this year for sure. But all of this doesn't elevate the movie over a 6 out of 10, with a hard tendency to a 7 out of 10. It's an okay movie, nearly even good, but they had maybe the last chance to make this one really count, before Tom Cruise isn't doing this anymore. He also looks visibly old now in this movie, and man, you blew it! You could have taken the chance to finish off a character, an arc, a whole franchise, but you took the easy route and made it just another Mission Impossible.